In the autumn-shadowed city of Verona, one that bore the echoes of Roman cunning and medieval deceit, lived a man named Vittorio de Lacca. He was a scholar of men's desires, a tactician of hearts. Not a lover in the conventional sense, but rather a student of the intimate game, of glances, silences, and the thousand invisible strings that bind one soul to another without ever touching skin. He had studied the works of Machiavelli not to conquer nations, but to conquer affections. To him, the human heart was not a sanctuary, but a fortress. And like all fortresses, it had its gates, its guards, its moats. Most men, he believed, charged at the walls with the force of sincerity and failed. Vittorio chose subterfuge, elegant, deliberate, philosophical, the first lie he would whisper to his apprentice. A melancholic youth named Emiliano is that love is pure. The second, that seduction is dishonest. What is truth if not the most convenient persuasion? Emiliano had followed him for months, curious about the myth of the man who had never been turned away by a woman, yet was never truly known by one either. Women remembered him like a song that lingers on the edge of memory, beautiful, haunting, incomplete. Vittorio's method was simple, or so it seemed. "Do not desire her," he said one evening, as they sat beneath the ancient arches of a wine-soaked plaza. "Desire her desire for you. Come the mirror in which she sees the version of herself she always longed to be." It was then that Emiliano saw her Lucia letters. She was not the most beautiful woman in the piazza, at least, not at first. But there was something in the way she watched the sky, as if expecting it to fall. Something in the way she touched the stem of her glass, as though it might disappear if not caressed gently. She was poetry written in a language Emiliano did. "Not yet speak, you must not approach," Vittorio instructed, watching Emiliano's eyes lock on hers. "Not until she feels the lack of your presence more than the certainty of your attention." "But how?" Emiliano asked, his voice trembling with the sincerity of youth. "How do I summon her gaze?" "You disappear into her periphery," Vittorio said. "You enter her story not as a man, but as a question." Emiliano obeyed. He positioned himself in Lucia's world without invading it, choosing the seat that gave her view of his silhouette, ordering the same wine she favored, echoing her laugh from afar like a forgotten harmony. Over days, the distance between them pulsed like a living thing. She began to notice, then to wonder, then to wait. And when he finally spoke on a rain-appelled morning as she stood beneath the awning of a bookshop, she smiled not in surprise, but in recognition. "Dreamed of you," she said. "But you weren't you. You were something I was missing." Emiliano blushed, unsure if he had earned the moment or merely inhabited it. "Then let me remain your absence," he replied, unsure whether he was seducing her or being seduced by the idea of her. But as their days grew longer, as their silences became more fluent than their words, Emiliano began to question everything Vittorio had taught him. For what began as a dance of shadows became, for him, a baptism in light, and light. Unlike strategy does not bend to will, he returned to Vittorio one night, broken by the contradiction within himself. "I can no longer pretend to be what she dreams," he confessed, "because now I dream of her." Vittorio did not respond immediately. He stared into the fire that flickered like doubt across his face. "Then you have failed," he said coldly. "You have surrendered power for emotion. You no longer control." "The story? But isn't that the point?" Emiliano asked. "To be changed by another? To forget the mirror and simply be seen?" The philosopher of seduction said nothing. For perhaps in that moment, he too remembered a woman one he had once known. Not as a strategy, but as a wound that refused to close. And so the story diverged. Emiliano began to love, not with tactics, but with truth. He no longer calculated pauses or curated glances. He laughed at the wrong moments. He cried in silence. They spoke words not chosen for their impact, but for their honesty. Lucia saw it. And slowly, she began to unravel the mask she too had worn, the one all people wear. When the world teaches them love is war, they became not seducers, but pilgrims, not actors, but authors. But far away, In another cafe, Vittorio watched. Another couple. He traced their dance. He mapped their tension. And once more, he whispered into the ear of a new disciple. Coquetry is not about beauty. It is about suggestion. Offer not yourself, but the possibility of being understood at something. In his eyes betrayed him, a hesitation. Fracture, was he truly the master of illusion? Or merely a man afraid of what the truth might cost? Part 2. The Mirror and the Flame. Months passed. Verona shifted into winter, streets echoing with the hush of falling snow and the quiet deliberations of lovers walking arm in arm. Emiliano and Lucia lived not in perfection, but in presence. They had no illusions left, only choices, daily, deliberate, sometimes difficult. And in the slow unraveling of artifice, Emiliano felt something he had never known under Vittorio's tutelage. Peace. But peace is a fragile thing, especially for those who once trafficked in power. Far across the city, Vittorio found himself restless. His reputation remained untarnished. New students arrived weekly, eager to learn the mechanics of charm, the architecture of allure. But his lessons now carried a note of dissonance, a hollow echo in the space where conviction used to be. It was during a private session with a promising young aristocrat named Isabella that the fracture widened. She was brilliant, feral, and unapologetically inquisitive. She did not want to be seduced. She wanted to understand the architecture of seduction, to wield it not as a mirror, but as a sword. You speak of manipulation, she said, but not of consequences. What happens when the game ends? Vittorio hesitated. The game never ends. Only players change. But what if one tires of the game altogether? She asked, narrowing her eyes. What if one begins to crave authenticity? He almost laughed, but found he couldn't. There was something in her voice, in the danger of her question, that reminded him of the boy he had once been. The boy who wrote love letters in the margins of philosophy books. The boy who once waited 5 hours in the rain for a woman who never arrived. Later that night, Vittorio wandered to the library, the forgotten wing, the one where time slept in dust. There, tucked between Machiavelli's discourses and an untouched volume of Sappho, he found an old journal. His own, in it the ink had faded. But the words still trembled with the hunger of youth. If I could be seen, truly seen, perhaps I would cease to vanish into the shadows of my own reflections. That line struck him like a blade. He closed the journal and left Verona the next morning, without word or ceremony. No farewell to students, no final aphorism, just silence. He traveled eastward through cities that did not know his name. He shaved his beard, wore simpler clothes, began to listen more than he spoke. In Prague, he learned to carve wood. In Budapest, he played chess in the park with old men who had lost everything and still laughed. In Vienna, he met a woman named Helena. She was not curious about who he had been. She asked instead what he feared. And when he told her honestly, she did not recoil. I fear I am only the roles I've played, he admitted one night. Then let the curtain fall, she replied, and live without an audience. In that moment, Vittorio wept, not because of her words, but because of how easily they entered the chambers he had kept locked for decades. Back in Verona, Emiliano and Lucia received a letter. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. You were right. Truth is not weakness. It is the final power. The letter contained no return address, only a pressed violet and the scent of tobacco and rosemary. Years passed. Emiliano and Lucia eventually opened a small school, not for seduction, but for storytelling. They taught young people not how to charm, but how to reveal, not how to win hearts, but how to open them. Sometimes, when the wind carried just right, Emiliano swore. He could hear the echo of Vittorio's voice and the laughter of their students. Become the question, whispered, and perhaps you will become the answer. But whether it was memory or ghost, he did not know. And in the quiet hours, as he watched Lucia sleep beside him, he would think of how far he had come, not from innocence to knowledge, but from illusion to clarity. Not a conquest, a return. Part 3. The Ghost and the Philosopher in the Quiet Hills of Slovakia. In a monastery that had long since ceased to believe in God but still held to the rituals of silence, Vittorio Delica lived his brother Luca. He did not preach, he did not write, he carved wood for the abbey, chapel, and tended the olive trees that shouldn't have grown so far north, yet somehow thrived in the monastic garden. But even the most secluded cloister cannot shield the heart from its own memory. Sometimes Vittorio Luca would hear the rustle of silk dresses that weren't there, or catch the scent of Lucia's perfume in the folds of the altar cloth. And sometimes, when he looked into the eyes of the younger monks, he saw Emiliano not as he had been, but as he might have become. Had he never met the old seducer? One night, during the liturgy of shadows of practice held in complete darkness, a voice spoke out from the void. "Why did you run?" Vittorio flinched. The voice was not spoken aloud, yet it shook the walls of his chest. "Why did you abandon your own scripture the moment it no longer served you?" He had no answer, only the slow ache of a past that refused to fossilize. That night, he returned to his cell and opened a journal he had not touched in years. He began to write not strategies, but questions. Can one be forgiven for teaching illusion in the name of protection? Is transformation ever pure, or merely another mask? Is love a surrender, or a silent war where both sides pray not to win? As he wrote, he felt the weight of his former name return, not as a curse, but as a ghost one that asked not to be banished, but buried properly. Back in Verona, Emiliano had begun to struggle with his own silence. Though the school flourished, Lucia's eyes still held galaxies for him. He felt something shifting, a dull hum beneath the quiet rhythm of love. It was not dissatisfaction, but nostalgia. Not for the tactics of his youth, but for the danger they represented. He missed the chase. Not of women, but of meaning. "I feel," he said to Lucia, one night as they shared a bottle of crimson wine, "as though I have become too honest." She looked at him with a knowing sadness. Truth without mystery is a room without shadows. Even love needs a place to hide. That night, as she slept, he went into the old storage room of the school and opened a box he had long avoided. In it, a single relic, a voice recorder. The one Vittorio had once used to archive his private aphorisms. Emiliano pressed play. The recording crackled. Then came the familiar, elegant baritone. "The seducer is not evil. He is simply terrified of being seen and not loved. So he teaches others to become invisible, believing that mystery is safer than intimacy." There was a pause, a breath. But eventually, every mask becomes the face. Emiliano closed his eyes. The machine clicked off. He understood then the final paradox Vittorio had never spoken aloud, that the true cost of seduction is not heartbreak, it is the hollowing of one's own soul. And so, Emiliano decided to leave Verona for a time, not to run, but to seek Lucia. In her quiet wisdom did not protest. "Go," she said, "but promise me this. Don't return until you're ready to be whole, not just wise." He kissed her with trembling certainty. His journey led him eastward, through ancient towns, crumbling cathedrals, borderlands stained by forgotten wars, and eventually to a monastery in Slovakia, where a monk named Luca carved wood with the gentleness of a man who once broke hearts without touching them. Did not recognize each other at first. Time had changed their bodies, softened their voices, slowed their reflexes. But when they spoke, something ancient stirred between them, older than tactics, deeper than regret. "You taught me to disappear," Emiliano said. "You taught me to stay," Vittorio replied. They sat in silence, not as master and student, not as sinner and confessor, but as men flawed, fragile, and finally willing to be seen outside. The olive trees shook in the wind that shouldn't have reached them. Inside, two former ghosts drank tea from chipped cups and said nothing more. And in Verona, Lucia began writing letters again. Not to Emiliano, but to herself, to the woman she had once been, to the love she still believed in. She wrote, "We were never meant to solve each other, only to illuminate the questions we feared to ask alone. Part 4: The Return of Names. Spring in Verona arrived early that year, as though impatient to resurrect what winter had buried. The apricot trees bloomed in defiance of frost, and the cobblestones of the old quarter shimmered with rain-fed memory. Lucia sat beneath a fig tree in the school's courtyard, rereading one of her own letters. It had not been meant for anyone else, yet she found herself folding it neatly and slipping it into an envelope with Emiliano's name on it. She did not know where he was, only that he would understand. 3 weeks later, he returned, not with fanfare or apology, but with a small bag slung over his shoulder, and eyes that had finally stopped searching for meaning and started seeing it. She saw it at once, the subtle difference between a man who has been away and one who has truly journeyed. "I brought nothing," he said, standing in the archway, "but you returned." She whispered, rising to meet him. "That is everything." They embraced, not with the desperation of reunion, but with the quiet certainty of gravity, two bodies remembering their orbit. Later, in the school's candlelit library, Emiliano unwrapped a small wooden figure he had carved himself. It was simple, a man, without a face, holding out a mask. "For the archive," he said. Lucia smiled. "For the mirror." Word of Emiliano's return traveled quietly through Verona, like an old song hummed by children who had never learned its lyrics. Former students returned. New ones arrived. What they found was something stranger, a philosophy that taught not how to enchant, but how to endure. Vittorio's still brother Luca in the East heard of this new wave of teaching. One evening, sitting by a frozen stream, he received a letter from Emiliano. It contained only a few words. "I no longer need to seduce the world to feel seen. I have learned to be visible to myself." Vittorio smiled. He remembered a time when such words would have struck him as weakness. Now they felt like prophecy. He wrote back, "For the first time in years, then I, too, have succeeded by becoming obsolete." Time passed. The school in Verona became more than an institution. It became a sanctuary for the emotionally exiled, for those who had tired of performance and longed for presence. Emiliano taught classes on vulnerability as architecture. Lucia began a seminar called Letters Never Sent, where students read the confessions they never dared voice aloud. And once a year, on the first day of spring, they told the story of the seducer who disappeared into a monastery, carved a new name for himself. Some believed it was myth, others believed it was salvation, but Lucia and Emiliano knew better. It was neither, it was simply the truth. Raw, flawed, unfinished. One evening, as they watched the students dance around a bonfire in the courtyard, Emiliano turned to Lucietters. "Do you think he still teaches?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Then, with a gentle smile, only in silence, and as the fire cracked and laughter rose to the starlit canopy, neither of them noticed the man watching from beyond the walls, his beard longer, his robe worn, but his eyes shining with the calm of one who had finally stopped running from his own reflection. He did not enter. He did not speak. He only watched, then turned, and vanished into the night. Part V. The face behind the mirror. Years passed in Verona like the slow turning of a page in a book that no longer wished to be finished. Ino and Lucia grew older, not in spirit but in patience. The school they had founded now had branches in Lisbon and Prague, each guided by former students who had chosen presence over persuasion, expression over enchantment. But something remained unresolved. The students spoke often of Vittorio, or the Phantom of Seduction, as some had come to call him. They turned him into a mythomaster who vanished at the height of his power, whose words still lingered like perfume in the halls of every emotional confession. Emiliano never corrected them. He never told them that the man had once stood in his place, that he had once whispered strategies into his ear like spells. But the truth had grown roots too deep to deny. He needed to see him again, not as a mentor, not as a myth, but as a man. And so, one autumn morning, Emiliano left Verona once more. This time with Lucilletters, their journey led them back to the edge of Slovakia, where the mountains brushed the clouds like questions reaching for answers. The monastery was quieter than before. Time had thinned its walls and its population. But Vittorio still, Brother Luca, to those few who remained, was there. He saw them from afar as they approached the garden, where he had planted olive trees that defied both soil and expectation. For a moment he froze, then he smiled. The three of them sat in the garden for hours, saying almost nothing. Language, after all, had already done enough damage. What they needed now was silence ripe, forgiving, and sacred. Eventually, Lucia spoke. "Do you regret it?" Vittorio turned toward the tree he had planted in the year he had stopped calling himself by name. "I regret how long I mistook control for love," he said. "And how often I taught others to do the same," Emiliano asked. "And now?" Vittorio said, "I see that every illusion I ever built was only a prayer for someone to look past it." They ate together that night. Bread, figs, olives, and laughter. Not the kind of laughter meant to charm or seduce, but the kind that bubbles up from the relief of being known. Before they left the next morning, Emiliano offered Vittorio a carved wooden box. Inside, the figure he had once sculpted, the man without a face. Holding a mask, Vittorio held it in his hands. Then, with trembling fingers, he placed the mask gently on the figure's face. "It's time," he said. "Let him be seen." They embraced. Not like student and master, not like forgiver and forgiven, but like two lives that had once circled each other in the language of seduction, and now found peace in the grammar of humility. Lucia took Emiliano's hand as they walked back down the path. "Do you feel lighter?" she asked. He nodded. "Because now I understand." "What? That the only art greater than seduction is surrender." They did not look back. Behind them, in the monastery garden, Brother Luca Vittorio placed the small wooden figure at the base of the oldest olive tree. Then he sat beside it, closed his eyes, and let the wind blow through him like a page. Finally allowed to turn, final chapter, the last silence years later. Long after Emiliano and Lucia had retired from teaching and the school had been passed on to new, gentler voices, a letter arrived in Verona. There was no return address. Inside, a single sheet of parchment and a hand that had once penned strategy like scripture. "When I taught others to seduce, I believed power was the path to love. But now I see love is what remains when power is no longer necessary. Thank you for showing me what I could not teach myself. In stillness, V." Lucia placed the letter in the school's library, between volumes of Plato and Rilke. Beneath a plaque that read, "Here rests the final lesson. To be known is not to be mastered, but to be met." In his final years, Vittorio, no longer Brother Luca, no longer the ghost of seduction, disappeared once more. This time, not into the shadows, but into the quiet of ordinary life. He was last seen walking through a village in southern Italy, carrying nothing but a small satchel and a book with no title. When he died, no one knew his full name, only that he had once carved faces into wood and listened more than he spoke. He was buried beneath an olive tree, one planted long ago from the seeds he had brought from the monastery garden. And above his grave, a stone marker read, "Here lies a man who once knew every secret and died with none." And so the story ends not with a final seduction, but with a final surrender. Because in the end, even the most artful illusion must bow to the simple miracle of being seen, without needing to perform. Not to conquer, not to charm, but to exist in truth, in stillness, in love.